And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining the Florida Food Policy Council's monthly Florida Food Forum. The forum is hosted by the Policy Committee of the Florida Food Policy Council. I am Del DeShant, the host of the forum. Our topic for this month is sacred nutrition, religion, and food justice. With us from the council is the council's Operations and Communications Manager, Kendra Love, and Kendra will handle the technical and managerial aspects of our meeting today. And I do want to note that I did just now learn that a colleague of mine from the University of South Florida is also going to take a minute or so at the very end of our broadcast to go over a survey instrument that he's working on. We've allowed him to do that. We want to take just a moment also to let everyone know that the Florida Food Policy Council relies on donations, memberships, and sponsorships for our operations. We are a chartered, not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing the health and security of the Florida food system. Please share support through the donation link on our website. For information on sponsoring a future forum, the website or any other aspect of the Florida Food Policy Council, please check with Kendra, and she's very easy to reach through the website. We're pleased to recognize two sponsors of the Florida Food Forum, FEED and J. Haskins Law. FEED, which is FHEED, stands for Food for Health, the Environment, Economy, and Democracy. It is based in Fort Lauderdale. FEED is a consultancy dedicated to the ideals of its name. It specializes in food systems planning, GIS analysis, advocacy, and education about food systems and health communities. The contact for FEED is Anthony Oliver. J. Haskins Law is located in Tampa and empowers communities with the legal and risk management tools needed to exercise food sovereignty. The contact for J. Haskins Law is Jesse Haskins. We're most appreciative of FEED and J. Haskins Law for sponsoring this month's forum. We invite other organizations and individuals to share in sponsorship as well. Again, contact Kendra for that. The focus of this edition of the Florida Food Forum is on the relationship of food systems and social justice. Research and lived experience of millions reveals that the systemic injustices of the food system are one of the most significant manifestations of cultural injustices. And yet it's one of the most overlooked elements by the general community, most Americans. Today, we look to change that for those tuning in today. Our topic again is sacred nutrition. The relevance of our topic to food policy is centered on the cultural nexus created by the collapse of sustainable local food systems and concurrently the colonization of our entire culture by the industrial food system. While this is happening everywhere, the most destructive and tragic consequences are occurring in those communities that have already been harmed due to political, economic, educational, creative marginalization. Food policy can make a real difference in these communities, and it can make a difference right now. If we're going to engage these issues and concerns, we need to start now. And what better way to do so than to consider what is being done in those great centers of cultural inspiration as well as cultural critique, namely religious centers. Religion has long been at the forefront of cultural critique, and it is also a place where new forms of social organization and community life are given birth and nurtured. And so we welcome to this month's forum two spokespeople, two representatives, two agents of change from the religious community. Today's topic is of special relevance to religious practitioners, but it's not just for religious practitioners, it's really for our entire culture. And so to tell us more about sacred nutrition, we're fortunate to have two talented religious professionals with us, the Reverend Gabriel Morgan and the Reverend Andy Oliver. Gabriel is the pastor of the St. Paul Lutheran Church and Faith Lutheran Church in Tampa, Florida. Faith Lutheran is the home of an urban garden called Seeds of Peace, Gardening in Faith Together, a joint effort together with the United Methodist Church of Tampa. The Reverend Andy Oliver is pastor of the Allendale United Methodist Church in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is a church committed to anti-racism and racial solidarity. He's grounded in liberation theology and following Jesus, a community organizer who always located himself with the oppressed, helping them to use their power to dismantle evil. We're very fortunate to have our two guests with us today. We'll begin with Pastor Gabriel and then go on to Pastor Andy. So I'm going to turn the program over now to the Reverend Gabriel Morgan. Gabriel, welcome indeed.
Thank you, Del. And if I may say also, thank you for all the work that you've done over the years and the inspiration you've been to me. I've known Del for a long time, so I'm very grateful for that. Kendra, can you put up my presentation now? We'll just start with the splash screen. While she's working on that, I'm going to pick my camera up here and just give everyone a little bit of a pan. I'm present here at our garden at Faith Lutheran, which is a joint effort, as Del said, of our church and First United Church of Tampa, which is a UCC congregation. And we're up to about 20 beds now, as you can see. They're in pretty good shape because of the dedication of our volunteers, including members of our church and Karen O'Rourke, who's a master gardener who's been helping us here lately. And as we get to the presentation here, I'll explain what some of our methodology is and why we're doing this garden, and I guess what some religious perspectives are on some of these policy questions. Okay, so Kendra, are you ready with the presentation?
Yes, it's opening right now.
Okay, thank you. So religion and food justice. This opening image here is basically a restored 5th century mosaic of the loaves and fishes from the feeding of the 5,000, a key story in the Gospels that's in the Church of the Multiplication in Tabgha, Israel. I thought that was a fitting metaphor for our time together today. Intersections of food and justice and the walk of religious communities. So I'm going to present this in 4 parts. I was asked to respond to 3 things here, and I'm going to do my very best to do that. The first is a little bit more introduction to our garden here at Faith, as well as the policies of my denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, on use of property for food production. Some leads on public policies favoring agrarian projects. I have to confess now from the outset that I really have no expertise on this. I can give you some leads from some research and involvement in other organizations, but I'm open to learning as much about this as I have to offer from each of you. And then finally, strategies for evolving food support into food production in religious communities. So the name Gift Center has evolved into Seeds of Peace Gift Center, or Gardening in Faith Together, because of our partnerships. I know this is the last point here, but I'll name that now. We have several partners in the work that we do. For our garden, it's both the First United Church of Tampa under the Reverend Bernice Powell Jackson and USF Urban Food Sovereignty Group, where I'm connected with Del and some other members who are on here today. We have over 20 beds now with our own irrigation and composting systems. We're growing into a food sovereignty paradigm. I wouldn't say we're quite there yet, but we're moving in that direction, trying to focus on and prioritize foods and vegetables that our neighbors here in this community prefer to eat. Produce is placed on the tables of our kinship-free markets, which are a mobile food pantry that happens both here and in other locations. And it's centered around the concept of solidarity, and unused produce then gets composted to help us grow new vegetables. So several years ago, before I was pastor here, maybe 6 years ago at this point, this congregation sat down with a new pastor and they said, we don't have a lot of resources, but we have a lot of land. So what can we do with that? And it's a situation that a lot of churches are in right now as we experience cultural shifts and churches re-envision their ministry models. I really appreciated your comment, Del, that religious communities can often be the source of and target of social criticism, as well as beds for cultivating new forms of human life. The Faithlands movement is really a movement across the country that sort of captures what we've gone through here in our context too. And from their website, this was started by the Agrarian Commons and the Agrarian Trust. Faithlands is a growing national movement to connect and inspire faith communities to use their land in new ways that promote ecological and human health, support local food and farming, enact reparative justice, and strengthen communities. And some churches have joined this movement not only by either starting gardens or leasing land on their property to local farmers, but even in some cases by donating their property to agrarian trusts in order to protect it for food production. So at the heart of the Faithlands movement is this idea that maybe religious communities have something to contribute to this larger movement around food justice and food production. Religious communities bring unique perspectives and motivations. For example, the Bible, it is perhaps not often known, is filled with gardening and farming imagery, as well as teachings on the importance of food justice and hospitality. And I provided some sample references for those who are interested to discovering more about the extensive use of gardening and farming imagery within the Bible. In Genesis, God is even framed as a gardener who creates this beautiful creation and puts our first parents in the Garden of Eden, which is filled with rich symbolic imagery. And we too, being made in God's image, are called to be gardeners and cultivators of this creation. So my approach is very similar to that of the current Pope's perspective in Laudato Si, which is a Roman Catholic encyclical. Now, there is some historical theology here that I'm going to resist the temptation to spend my entire presentation on. This is where I have an area of expertise, and I absolutely love it and could teach a whole class on it. Just different connections between Luther and ancient church fathers and philosophers and even other religious traditions that all have something to offer about the themes of food and bread and food production. From Luther's reflections in the Large Catechism on "Give us this day our daily bread," he says not only is it food, but it's also everything that happens in society to allow for the peaceful cultivation of food. To St. Gregory of Nazianzus, an ancient Eastern church father of the 4th century, who spoke of the connection between the divine harmony of the triune God with the natural harmonies and beauties of this world that we find ourselves in. William James, a philosopher in varieties of religious experience, spoke of these themes of mysticism and repentance or change of heart that are common to a lot of traditions. And also I love some themes in the Tao Te Ching about the wisdom of natural harmony and our need to get back to that. There are a lot of different approaches that one can take, and I would love to spend some more time on that in the Q&A for those who are interested. But for now, I'll move on to the next slide. So I and our church are members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. There are several Lutheran denominations of varying persuasions about some of the issues that we're discussing today. My denomination, I would say, is the strongest of all of them on questions of food justice and food production, but that does not mean that we don't have area for growth. Church gardens are becoming more common in my denomination, but they're still not the predominant paradigm for land use when congregations come to a crossroads and need to do some mission revisioning. However, we do have a major program called ELCA World Hunger. And that program does a great job of making connections between the climate crisis, food production, and social justice. And they are working to address food insecurity and systemic causes of that food insecurity. The concept of food sovereignty, I would not say has made many inroads within the institutions of my denomination, but there is a strong sense of education and sustainable development in these programs. So one of the featured programs of ELCA World Hunger is the Global Farm Challenge. And I have provided a quote down there to give you an idea of that program. The goal of ELCA World Hunger's Global Farm Challenge is to raise $500,000 to equip communities around the world and in our country with livestock, seeds, tools, training, and other agriculture-related activities to turn a hungry season into a hopeful season. Now, some of this stuff you may know. some of my motivations for why I've really plugged all the way into these garden ventures that I found myself in as a pastor, is because there are connections between food and injustice and the climate crisis that are quite strong. Before COVID, we had approximately 10% of the US population experiencing food insecurity, and those numbers have tripled among some households with children after COVID. There are approximately 19 million Americans who live in a food desert, which is defined in urban context as a 1 mile radius, according to a 1 mile radius, with over 2 million lacking transportation or adequate means of access to good food. And there are racial disparities in the injustice of hunger. Black and Hispanic populations are twice as likely to live under such conditions. Moreover, food and food waste and the injustice of hunger is directly tied to climate change. This slide is a little bit blurred here in the format of the presentation, but I can correct for that later. Something happened with the formatting. But basically, with all this hunger, we nevertheless throw away a tremendous amount of food that actually has an enormous carbon footprint. So if you calculated the rough estimate of the carbon footprint of all the food we throw away globally, both individually and as companies and corporations, it would be roughly equivalent to the country of India, the entire carbon output of India. It is a huge, huge, huge impact on the climate crisis. And it's something that we can address through changing our culture and our practices around food and food production. Okay, public policies. I titled this section with a question mark. I'm going to provide here some leads that I think your organization could explore and that I'm also learning more about as I present them to you. So I'm currently a sponsoring committee member for the DART Network's Care for Creation program. This is a new initiative. DART, it stands for Direct Action and Research Training. And it's a collection of local organizations across the country that are made up of different church bodies doing justice on a local scale. Reverend Oliver may well be a member of such a chapter in his context, and I see him shaking his head, yeah. So one of the things that we learned in our research meetings, our national research meetings, is something called the Good Food Purchasing Program that I want to bring to your attention today. This program is a national network with partners across several states, and they do not yet have a Florida partner as far as I'm aware, so you could reach out and potentially become that connection for them. What they do is increase movement coordination with metric-driven standards, enhance capacity of local coalitions, activate policy, empower governments by sharing tools and possible targets, and leveraging buying power via increased supply chain knowledge. And an example of this program at work is the Food Forward New York City 10-year policy plan that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Before I get to that, though, I do want to mention that I have a friend of mine who works for one of the city council members here in Tampa. And I learned recently that Tampa has a city land trust, and they're sitting on a bunch of property that they don't necessarily have active plans for. It's possible from a public policy standpoint that the city could be persuaded, perhaps even pressured to dedicate some or even most of that land to agricultural products like programs like we're discussing today. Now, the Food Forward New York City plan, I want to provide some quotes to give you a sample of what that's like, and then there's a link there on the PowerPoint that you can do further research on. This food system plan has 5 overreaching goals: food access for all New Yorkers, worker protection, good jobs and economic opportunities, modern, efficient infrastructure and supply chains, sustainability from production to disposal, and education, communication, and administrative support to implement the plan. What I discovered in the second quote here, it says, "It may be the first time that a concept such as food sovereignty has entered into common parlance and is rapidly gaining recognition." Now, it just occurred to me I hadn't defined that phrase yet. I apologize. For those who are not familiar, food sovereignty is sort of a growth or a development or a step beyond the concept of food security. So hunger and food security are typically distinguished in the sense that food security isn't just about not feeling hungry, but it's that you have ready means and transportation and connections to be able to satisfy your hunger needs over a long period. Food sovereignty is the idea that people should have control and say over their own security and food, that they don't just avoid the need for hunger because programs come in and give them what they're supposed to eat or tell them what they should grow, that they're empowered to grow the food that they want for themselves. So New York is sketching out a right to food. This concept, articulated as the right to adequate food, is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, has the physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for procurement by the UNFAO. It is sorely needed in a country with such vast inequities in food access and affordability. The policy plan puts to rest the illusion of individual responsibility, instead articulating a complex web of socioeconomic relationships and supply chains that enable and empower folks to get access to good food. Now, finally, if I may, just briefly at the end of my presentation, I'd like to just note some strategies for food production in religious communities. There are two toolkits that I recommend to those of you who want to learn more, who maybe you are a religious leader that want to have this conversation with your congregation, or maybe you know a local church that is a good candidate for purposing some of their land for food production. Arosha is an international Christian organization that does climate activism, and they're the only officially Christian organization in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They have a great guide on the basics of starting church gardens that I would recommend, and the link is provided here. And also the Faithlands movement, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, also has toolkits for starting church gardens, which can be found at the link there. I'll just tell you from personal experience, some of the big hurdles with gardens is getting adequate irrigation, volunteer retention, and gaining mission clarity. My understanding is that most new community garden startups fail within the first 3 years. And the reason is because there are tremendous hurdles to making these things work. And that we don't yet have a culture that recognizes its value and importance as a sort of default posture. And that's part of the goal of this larger movement. It's not just that we find resiliency to address the climate crisis, or find ways to grow food that we prefer, or to address local food issues, but to really shift our whole culture and orientation toward the natural world, so that we can get back into an equilibrium of harmony and relationship rather than constant domination. And these little examples of gardens and food production in religious communities, I think, is an important signal that that shift is taking place. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pastor Morgan. Inspiring, encouraging, and really a powerful demonstration of what can be done, and presentation on resources that are available to religious communities, but really to all of us, I think. Great. Our next presenter is Pastor Andy Oliver from Allendale United Methodist Church in St. Petersburg. And I'm going to turn it over to Andy now with our welcome and our thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you, Reverend Morgan, for that incredibly detailed presentation. I'm going to take a different approach and tell a story about how we kind of fell into doing this work. I arrived at Allendale 5.5 years ago to a church that was slotted to close. I got a letter my second day here saying that we were on a list of churches to close. We had dwindled down from the height of 1968 to 700 people in church to having 40 in church. And it just was becoming increasingly impossible to sustain the ministry here. And so we didn't have any time to lose, and we went for it. From the beginning, I kind of tried to give a vision of what kind of church we would become in the coming years. And that would be one that would be radically inclusive, one that would be centered in justice, one that would center the voices of the marginalized. And that was an important part to our work in food justice. One of the things that happened early on when a certain president was elected, we made the decision to open up our building for free meeting space to anyone in the community that was doing the work of justice. It didn't matter what kind of justice. If they were doing the work of justice and shared our values, then they had free meeting space. And so our building immediately went from being empty throughout the week to being completely full. We went from being a church of 40 on Sunday to a church of over 1,000 members of the community, many of them coming multiple times a week. Allendale became a hub for social justice. And as a result, of course, food insecurity and food justice was on the minds of many. In St. Petersburg, here, this church is located within a quarter mile of 5 different grocery stores, major chains, okay, not small, large grocery stores, including 2 Publixes across the street from each other. Just a few miles south, on the other side of the dividing line, in South St. Pete, there are miles and miles and miles without any grocery stores, and they haven't had them for years. Food desert, as Reverend Morgan talked about in his presentation. So as we started to look at the way that we transformed our empty building into making a space for community, we started to also look at our land that was surrounding us, surrounding the building. And we're asking the same questions that Reverend Morgan talked about. How can we use this land to do justice? Part of opening ourselves up to the community and being a church that was really about the work of the community meant that we were connected with some pretty awesome people. And one of those people was Ray Wunderlich. Ray Wunderlich is a resident here that lives, a quarter mile away. And he has a passion not only about gardening, but also Florida native plants. So he first came to me when he saw the opportunity to restore a lot of the landscape around the church into, original Florida native plants. And he asked me if we would be okay if we planted 30 pine trees. And so I came out with him on a day, and he had a whole team of people, and we planted 30 pine trees. Pinellas originally was covered in pine trees. And so he wanted to see that happen here. And then, I turned over the reins, and that's a reoccurring theme in Allendale's turnaround, is letting go of power, letting go of authority, letting go of the keys. We have probably about 100 people in the community with keys to our church. There's really nothing in here worth stealing. If someone stole our computers, it would be a blessing to us. We really wanted to have this space open. And so we also turned over the grounds. And Ray has a community of people that come and have replanted every single plant around our church to Florida native species. In addition, Ray started a garden in our courtyard. I got a picture of this first garden, if you want to show it. This garden here was, we thought we'd try it out and see, and it's been maintained by a team of church members, but mostly people in the community that aren't involved in anything else other than doing gardening here at Allendale. This garden, as well as a few others, last season achieved 1,600 pounds of food. We sold 250 pounds of those food. Volunteers took 680 pounds of that food, but 1,600 was donated. 1,600 pounds. Some of the things we plant in the summer: watermelon, winter melon, pumpkin, a ground cover that puts nitrogen in the soil. In the fall, collards, kale, cilantro, arugula, turnips, carrots, beets, chard, cilantro. But it quickly, became known that we needed to expand. And so we looked on property that was on the neighborhood side of the church, one that got a lot less foot traffic, and started our second garden. And you'll see that here. When we started to build this second garden, we had two neighbors who were pretty unhappy about it. They both were ardent Trump supporters, and so some people in the community thought that it really wasn't about the garden, it was about a difference in values. But regardless, they complained to the city, and you'll notice there's not much planted in this yet because we have been involved in, we have finished, but it took us over a year to get the right to garden on this part of our land. In the state of Florida, thanks to a law that was passed a few years ago, anyone in their residential plot of land can put a garden up, in their front yard or backyard without any restrictions. But it's not so for churches. And so we had to go through a year-long process of changing our land use right and exceptions to our document to allow us the ability, with a full hearing, that we had a volunteer in the community stepped up and represented us. He did an amazing job, Jeremy Reynolds, as a paralegal. And then we had about 30 people from the community, some from the church, but most from the community, that came and gave testimony to why this was essential to either the practice of their faith or just their practice as a human. And as a result of the challenge of these two people that wanted this garden not to exist, we gained over 50 volunteers because it made the papers, it was on the news, it became known. And so anytime Allendale, in the course of its 5.5-year turnaround, has faced any type of opposition, it is always turned into growth, more people participating in the work. A lot of the people who participate in these gardens aren't, members of the church, and this is a way of them participating in the call of God on their lives, whether they know it or not, in the participation of being participating in creation care, participating in feeding those who are hungry, and in being in solidarity with them. And so when we got the rights to garden here, we actually got the right to garden on every single inch of our property. And so we have just recently almost finished the completion of garden number 3. And you'll see that right here. As you can see, it's still in process right now. This garden will be the largest garden, and incidentally is much closer to one of the neighbors that was so frustrated by it. But we'll share the produce when it comes. But these gardens have helped us to fill a gap, and so all the food that's donated is donated to organizations on the south side of St. Pete to help make sure that people have fresh fruits and vegetables. And again, it has offered a way, continued to offer a way for us as a community to be authentic to who we say we are. When we say our welcome statement every week, part of our welcome statement says, no matter your race, ethnicity, economic situation, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, background or belief, age or condition of ableness, whether single or partnered, you are God's beloved and are welcome here. And, it helps us to live into that statement, the work in these gardens, to get our hands dirty. Reverend Morgan mentioned that Jesus was, that God was seen as a gardener, and this God who's a gardener isn't afraid of dirt, right? Is getting his hands dirty, and so we shouldn't be either. It helps us to stay connected to the earth. Part of our communion liturgy, when we before we come to the table to receive the bread and the cup, a center action for us that all are invited to this table to feast. We have to remember that there are so many around us that don't have food, and so it calls us to be the body of Christ out in the world. what a better way to do that than to actually grow fruit here on our property. But part of the liturgy that we say is it's a confession. We confess we have not heard the cries of the needy. Forgive us, we pray. So we have not heard the cries of those who are being marginalized and oppressed. We have not heard the cries of those who are crying out in hunger. All of those things are encapsulated in that confession. But because it's a confession, if we say those words and then continue to do the same thing, continue to be in spaces where we aren't hearing, then it's not really a true confession. It's not making any impact on our lives. And so one of the ways that we live that out is on Sunday mornings or in our newsletter, or as many opportunities as possible. I have to give up my pulpit to people who are crying out. The cries of the needy, the cries of the hungry, the cries of the oppressed. I have to give up the space that is afforded to me by the title on my name, and recenter the voices that are on the margins, those that are oppressed, those who are hungry, so that we can hear the cries of the needy, hear the cries of the oppressed, hear the cries of those who are marginalized right there in worship, that it's an act of worship to do this. And so working in the garden is actually a response to this call that's upon our lives to respond. When you hear the cries of the oppressed, when you hear the cries of the hungry, it is much, much harder to do nothing. And so anyway, these three gardens, you can take down the photo now. These three gardens have been the center of our work here and how we're living out. And we plan to build more gardens. We plan to possibly use the land that's across the street from us, connected to our parking lot, as a site for affordable housing. And that we may tie in gardening to that as well, to continue to explore how we will use our land to create a more just and equitable community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pastor Morgan and Pastor Oliver. Tremendous, inspiring to me, beyond words, what you guys are doing, the work that you put into it, the care and the connections which you both made between the work that you're doing, practical, emphatic, boots on the ground, hands in the dirt work, and the greater vision of your religious mission and your calling. Would that more of us share that calling, but it's through the work that you guys do that more and more people will share that calling. The calling is obviously not just for direct religious service to a religious community or religious organization, but really to greater humanity. And when religions recognize that their work is not just for their own confessional, their own particular religious vision and agenda, but really for all the world, as that begins to happen, I think we have a chance. I think there's an opportunity for all of us to make the world a better place. We're going to open it up to questions. I just wanted to get one thought out there too, just a term that I've been hearing a lot more of that I wanted to just get out on the table is food apartheid, replacing the concept of food desert with the concept of food apartheid. A desert is a natural phenomenon, and apartheid is a human creation. And what we have historically referred to as food deserts are really, on the face of it, in terms of the social systems that create them, really a form of food apartheid. I just wanted to get that term out there because I think I'm going to begin using it myself. But in the context of our presentations today, I just wanted to share that with our audience. And I think going forward, we're going to see that term used a lot more. I think it really gets closer to the heart of what the challenges are. I'm excited about this. I would just love to talk with both of you, myself, for the rest of the afternoon. But we're going to open it up to our guest, to our questions that have been sent in, as well as to anyone that may be on the line. And in that context, I'm going to turn it over to Kendra to go ahead and present our questions. Kendra, if you would.
Thank you, Del, and thank you to both of our guests today. We are going to open up to question and answers. If you have one, please go ahead and drop it in that chat box. We do have one from Sandy, and Sandy asks if either of you offer legal aid to those convicted of stealing food from stores, though I'm not sure if people get convicted of that. So the question was if you offer legal aid.
Oh, go ahead.
We try to provide, since there are a number of ways, but I'm not sure that we really have the resources or the expertise to be able to provide legal aid specifically. Maybe I'm not sure I really understand the question.
So for us, part of our growth has meant we've had a lot of new people come. We have a team of 30 lawyers who have joined the church at different times. And if someone came to me with that issue, I would bounce it out to them, and a lot of times they know who to connect people with. Also, one of our lawyers, Ricoeur, is a civil rights attorney and often has taken up cases that no one else will. And Jeremy Reynolds, now, who volunteered with us to fight for this garden, actually got hired by her because of working with us as our paralegal. That would be someone that I would think to connect them with, and if they couldn't represent them and offer aid, then I'm sure they would find someone.
Great. Kendra, any other questions?
I don't believe we have other questions directly in the chat box, but I think we can open it up if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question. I think we do have a few callers on the phone. If you're on the phone and would like to ask a question, just push the *6 and that'll unmute you. Or if anyone on the call would like to just unmute and ask, that's okay as well.
Okay, as we're waiting for those questions to come in, let me pose one to both of our guests. The work that both of you are doing is inspirational. I'm sure anyone that is on the line today or enjoying the visuals is very impressed with this. I certainly am, and I've been knocking around this terrain for quite some time. What would be your recommendation to a congregant? And I know that this maybe is a little risky to ask the question, but after all, we're talking about religion, so I guess we can take some risks. But what would be your recommendation to a congregant to bring forward an idea for her or his congregation to initiate a project like yours? I don't know the deeper origins of both of your work. If it does sound like it was an inspiration from the leadership, from Pastor Oliver and Pastor Morgan. But what if you're not the pastor of the church, you're not the imam, you're not the rabbi, you're not the leader of the church, but you're someone in the congregation? What would be a strategy you might recommend for such a person to pursue? Oh, that's for both of you or either of you.
Yeah, I'll start. I'd recommend finding a champion, like we found in Ray Wunderlich, or actually he found us. Without Ray, we would not be able to do this work. And so finding someone who's willing to dedicate a ton of time and build a team of people that's able to share the work, I think that is probably where I would start.
That's great. The champion model, excellent. And Pastor Morgan, any recommendations from you?
I would agree. Until there's a connection with the minister and some of the key lay leaders, perhaps council members, depending on the denomination, of the motives for doing such a project, that it's not just to get traction there on the church, which is great, but that we're shifting our culture as it relates to food and the climate crisis. Until then, yeah, you're going to need champions who can keep bringing it up and keep the momentum going, because one of the challenges, as I mentioned, is volunteer retention. It's very easy for people to get burned out if there's a lot of work being done by a small number of people. And we've seen that here. We'll have someone come in and they'll be really charged, take on too much, they get worn out. And it just to cultivate that champion, if you will, with the right amount of throttle on the work and the steps and everything, because burnout's really easy for projects like these. So
wonderfully said. Kendra, it looked like I saw a number of questions coming in the chat box. If you want to field those for us now, Kendra, I'll turn it over to you again.
We did have a question from Tim about any hints on sustaining the labor requirements of these efforts.
I suppose we'll start on that one. I think one thing that's really needed that for some reason is kind of a challenge is that a lot of us kind of tend to get sort of scattered and disconnected. But when you're better networked, all the different organizations and churches and whatnot doing gardens like this, it makes everybody else's work a lot easier, because you can plug people into resources and things. And if there's an extra volunteer present from time to time, it makes work days so much easier. So I guess one thing I would say is plug in a little bit at a garden that's already up and running, and learn a little know-how, get a feel for it, and then you'll start to see things that can translate, and it might make it easier for you to replicate where you're at.
Great. And maybe Andy, do you have any suggestions on how other churches can join the alliance with other churches?
I can't speak to an official alliance. Maybe Reverend Morgan can, but I know that several churches have reached out to us because they've seen our story, and so we've done what we could to help them get started. And we've also been in partnership with a community garden that's been led by Carla Bristol here in St. Pete. That's a youth garden where she's got a lot of Black and brown youth who are maintaining a huge garden on the south side of St. Pete. And so all kinds of people have reached out, and we've kind of formed our own alliance once we kind of made it known that this was something that we cared about.
Wonderful. I did see a hand up from James Cavendish. Did you want to ask a question, sir?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to ask sort of the opposite of what Del was asking. Del asked what a particular congregate can do to get a church involved. I'm curious too about how we can get the upper leadership of a denomination to buy into this. So we have these successful congregational efforts. What can we do to get like dioceses or larger entities involved in this? And have either of you encountered any obstacles in doing that or challenges?
I feel like that one I can speak to a little more directly. I feel a pinch on that in my own synod, because on the one hand, we have some sense of the value of this with the ELCA World Hunger Program, but in local synods, when churches are struggling and looking to repurpose land use, they often tend to default to affordable housing. And the reason is there's a simple transition to revenue there, okay? I hate to say it, but when you get into a situation like that where you're really struggling, it's hard for people to not get tunnel vision about the desperation of keeping your organization functioning. You see what I'm saying? And it's a real need too. That's the other challenge. But my concern is that when, because we did a little discernment about that ourselves. A lot of developers, probably most of them, they have certain bottom lines about minimum number of units and how high in order for it to be financially feasible for them. And that's going to basically strangle anything else that you're going to do with the land there. I think that like synod and like diocese leaders need to see like viable pathways to sustainability for them to be persuaded to implement it more at scale. And I'm not even sure I know how to get there yet, because even though we've been doing this garden for 5 years at our church, we're still not at a sustainable point yet. I mean, that's just the reality. Like, it's still, we put more into it than we're able to produce from it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's a really, really sticky wicket, and we need an answer to that question quickly. And I know that's not quite an answer, but I'm just saying I'm right there with you. Like I need to know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Andy, do you have any input on that? I think this is a very critical point for our broader deliberations, and also in terms of policy, because this comes right into the heart of policy.
You know, I'll share briefly something related to this, and then answer your question, because someone else asked in the chat about us getting permission from the city, if that gave permission for all churches in the city to do so, and no, it didn't. That would have to happen on the state level. Really, it could happen on the city level, but it'd be much easier to happen on the state level, since the state just passed one for residential as well. And there seems to be a lot of cross-party support for something like this. But as far as the denomination goes, I know in the United Methodist Church in Florida, our bishop has really centered food justice, and the number of people that can be fed, especially during the pandemic. That was one of the initiatives that he took up, and so there's been nothing but support from the denomination and encouragement for that. I'll say this though, as a church that is on perhaps the theological spectrum edge of Florida United Methodism, we've received support and everything, but sometimes when the denomination gets involved in what we're doing, it makes it harder for us to reach the broad types of people that we reach. And so sometimes denominational support can kind of go against what we're trying to do. But they have been extremely supportive and celebrated our successes with the gardening.
That's great, Andy. We have, just as a quick note, we have a program coming up on Florida Food Forum that's going to deal with municipalities and municipal ordinances for urban agriculture. And Kendra, I think that's coming up in the next couple of months. Am I correct?
Yes, that will be our July forum on July 30th, I believe.
Exactly right. And we're going to have a representative from St. Petersburg, from Pasco County, and from the city of Newport Richey, all of which have taken initiatives to develop urban agriculture ordinances. And since we are on the subject of religion and food systems, I'll note that one of the challenges that I'm conscious of, two the challenges. One, exactly what Andy pointed out, which is the what's often thought of as the highest and the best use, which is a real a municipal planning term, highest and best use. What's thought of as the highest and best use is understood only in the context of economics. And so when you're up against that, you're going to lose every battle, because it's going to be highest and best use to put some sort of a structure onto the property, especially one that is multifamily.
Let me, if I can jump in real quick, when we made the decision to give away room usage and to give away land to this gardening, we had a handful of people that were scared that this was going to pull us under financially, because we were just barely making it. The opposite happened. Okay, so the year before, when we were charging rent and getting a few $1,000s a year, the year after, when we gave it away, the first year we got over 10,000.
Yeah.
The next year over 20,000. The gardening, we have spent this much and received this much in donations.
Yes.
All from people in the community that want to have a cause to give to and be a part of something. So we have found the more that we have made really bad economic decisions, we have actually, it's turned out for the better for us, if that's what's important.
To which I say, in the spirit of all religions, amen, brother. Tell the story. Tell the story. That's the story that needs to be told. And I love that story, and I believe that story can be replicated anywhere. Would that we had but the heart, the wisdom, the vision, and the commitment to make it happen. We work with Habitat for Humanity up here, and they made just the opposite decision. They had a 1-acre community garden, thriving, producing literally hundreds and hundreds of pounds of food. And they made a decision that they were going to close down the garden and they were going to turn it into a living space, turn it into dwellings. And we made the argument that the farm use was a much better use, both in terms of productivity, but also in terms of mission. But we didn't win that one. You won that one, Andy, and good for you. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. So I know that Dr. William Schombacher is on here, and we want to give him like 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes at the most, for a project that directly relates to this.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the great presentation. And I'll just be real brief. Many of the questions here related to how can we sort of organize a larger effort is actually in the early stages with the USF Food Sovereignty Group. We are in the final stages of preparing a survey for faith leaders in the area who have either been involved in or wish to become involved in community garden and food production efforts. So the USF Food Sovereignty Group can be a good hub in the near future to start these conversations and to organize really along these lines. Reverend Oliver, I work with currently in a grant with Carla with the St. Pete Youth Farm. So we got to meet. And Gabriel Morgan is also involved with the USF Food Sovereignty Group. So I will put my information and the Food Sovereignty Group's information in the chat. So please reach out to me or Professor Jim Cavendish, who just spoke. He's also a part of this project, and we will all get in touch about future collaborations together. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Will. We have very little time left. I do want to put out the idea right now that we will do this again, that there's so much energy, there's so much interest around this that we should devote another food forum to this, which we will do. That being said, in the time that remains, Kendra, I want to turn it over to you to share with everyone that's listening, as well as that have the recordings, for our next food forum that'll be coming up at the end of June. Kendra?
Yes, so thanks everyone for joining us. We do hold these forums at the last Friday of the month. So June, we do have an upcoming forum as well. Right now, we are looking at the topic of seed saving and projects and programs. So we do not currently have the event information up, but that should be up early next week. And you'll be able to register on Eventbrite just as you did this time. Please check our Facebook, our website, our YouTube channel. We do edit these videos a little bit and then we post them the following week. So we'll be doing that and sending out emails as well. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you all. And special thanks to Pastor Gabriel Morgan and Pastor Andy Oliver. We commend you for your work. We salute the wonderful work that you're doing. And to the degree that we possibly can, we want to encourage everyone to learn about what's happening in your own community. And if you're near Pastor Gabriel's church in Tampa, Pastor Oliver's church in St. Petersburg, stop by, say hello, and get involved. And get involved in the Florida Food Policy Council. We survive it all on the basis of your goodwill, but especially on the basis of your donations and contributions to our work. If you can see your way clear to donate a little bit to our work, that would be wonderful. We do survive on the basis of our donations and our gifts. So share if you possibly can, and join us again next month for the next issue of the Florida Food Forum. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for supporting the work, and thank you to our guests.